Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Great to be here with you. My name's Ruth Cheesley, and I'm project lead for Mautic, which is an open source marketing automation platform. We're used by around 50,000 websites around the world to power their digital experience. And I'm also co-founder of the Women of Open Source project. Going back to sort of 2019, giving a bit of backstory about where this situation came from, our security process at that point was a little bit like this, basically. Bits and pieces all over the place, a bit jumbled up, a bit messy. We had a private security email list, and then people would create a GitHub issue if it was seen that that email that we received on our email was relevant for us to resolve. But nobody really was taking ownership. There was no centralized list of the issues that we'd resolved in the past or the issues that we were currently working on, really, and no one was owning the process. And our security releases were a little bit ad hoc. Basically, if someone shouted loudly enough at us about where was my security vulnerability, then it would be released. So this is in the first sort of 5-6 years of our project's existence. A 0-day vulnerability happened in 2021. There's nothing like a 0 day to make you realize, A, how inadequate your security process is, and B, that you need to actually improve it. So when we had this 0 day, we got through it in the end, but after it, we all kind of realized we need to get things a little bit more organized. We need a better process. We need to have a tool where we manage all of the communication so that everyone in the team can see what's going on and the researcher can see. And at that point, we came across a tool that was relatively new to the market that actually enabled this kind of functionality. So this was kind of 2021, 2022, and we used this tool to enable researchers to submit things that they'd found with our product, to centralize all of the communication. So our marketing people were on there so they could communicate about how we were going to release it in the comms and everything like that. And also there was a tiny little bonus that we could give people to say thank you for finding things, which was supplied by this platform. So it seemed like a great improvement on what we had at the time, right? At least it was a central place. It would be our public-facing repository of all the issues we'd worked on. And our process looked a little bit like this at the time. So the yellow bits are the bits which the tool took care of. The blue bits were things that we did as a project. So it came into the system, we would triage it and say whether it was relevant. We would inform the researcher, but we still had to work on that fix ourselves. It was very difficult for us to involve that researcher in fixing something unless they actually gave us a code sample privately, for example, which we still then had to go and test on our repository. And also, we had various internal processes that we used to collaborate away from the researcher, where we didn't necessarily want to have all of their communication happening with them. And then when we were releasing the fix, we had this whole process of informing the researcher, creating the release notes, and so on and so forth. So in effect, that tool became our backlog. It was like our backlog of security issues. And it worked really well for a couple of years, and then they got acquired. And they got acquired by a company who were only interested in AI projects. So we had 6 weeks' notice to switch to a new tool because they were going to stop supporting any projects that were not AI/ML focused. So you're probably thinking, oh, yeah, your own fault for choosing a proprietary tool. Yes, it was. But it was also quite a difficult thing for us because we needed to then figure out what are we going to do. Like, this tool has answered all of the problems we had, and now it's going away. And we need to figure out what we're going to do next. But it was also an opportunity for our security team to figure out what do we actually need in a workflow, and what does our ecosystem need? What's going to be the most useful tool for us to use going forwards? So this was my first response, like, okay, I've got all these other things on my plate right now, and now this big urgent thing has come in. Where do I start? So I started off by asking other open source projects, what do you do for your security processes? What tools are you using? How are you managing this process? We did have some frustrations with the tooling that we were using. So we couldn't collaborate easily with anyone other than our security team. So at that time, we were working in a private GitHub repository, and that's like an all or nothing. Invite someone, they can see all the security issues you're working on, and that doesn't work for us for like one researcher who wants to help fix something. We also were often getting people chuck stuff over the fence without much information, and then we were then going to have to go through and find out all the information that we needed in order to create that advisory, in order to understand it, in order to publish the release when we were fixing it. We were juggling 3 systems, which felt a bit too many. It was quite complicated for us. And also fixing security issues that affected more than one version of our software was a real pain. It was a real nightmare having to do that. It was lots of manual work. And there still wasn't really a central list of security advisories that had previously been released, because this system went from the time we started using it forwards. We couldn't add old advisories or old issues that had previously been resolved. So after having conversations with open source projects, it became apparent that there was a beta feature from GitHub in their security advisories that enabled anyone to submit a security issue to an open source project. So it was something at that time you had to actually turn on. You had to enable it. It wasn't available by default. But this sounded like it could be something that we could explore, because we already use GitHub for our PRs, we already use GitHub for our issues, so people are kind of familiar with that environment. So I started looking into it, and what it does is when you actually submit one of those advisories, it creates a triage list for your team to review of advisories that people have submitted that they think are related to your project. And you can then go through and look at those, but you can also draft your own advisories there. So it would also allow us to backport all of our historical ones into this system as well. So at first sight, it looked quite interesting. A couple of gotchas. It's only available on public repositories, so you don't have this functionality on private repositories. And a nice thing with this is it also ties into GitHub's advisory database. So as soon as you publish an advisory on your repository, pretty soon afterwards it appears on GitHub's main security advisories directory, and that's used by a lot of the industry. So it ties in really seamlessly. You don't have to submit it there. They automatically add it. So what does it look like for a user? Well, they create a draft advisory, and they're asked for details. I don't have a pokey thing, but they're asked for the details. So they're asked to give you information about the impact, about the ecosystem that affects. So you see this for our project, we're in the Packagist ecosystem, and then it asks you for the name and the affected versions. If they know it, they provide it. And what we've actually found since we moved to this system is that people are trying to give us as much information as possible, because eventually this will be public. So they are really taking the time to actually fill this in. And then it also encourages them to submit the severity score and the CWE, and to credit people as well. And they don't always get it right. Like you do still have to apply your own logic. Is that severity score actually right? Is the CWE actually the right one to use? But at least it gives you a head start, whereas before the information wasn't even submitted. And then we can decide whether we're going to accept this report or whether we reject it. So if it's not something that falls into our security advisory policy, we can reject it. If we've already had that submitted, we can reject it as a duplicate, and we could add that person onto the advisory that we're actually working on, so they can follow that advisory, because they're also a finder and a reporter. And we can also then, and this is the bit that really helps us a lot, is start a temporary private fork. So this is kind of the equivalent of clicking the fork button on a repository, but it's completely private, and it's only accessible to the people who you add onto that private advisory. So it lets you work in like a sandboxed environment with whoever you invite to your advisory on fixing this issue. So for us, this was a huge improvement in our workflow, because now it's not just the security team needs to fix this issue. It's whoever wants to help work on this issue can help fix this issue. And it's exactly the same process as you would use working on a normal pull request. It's just that you have this secret URL, basically, that's only accessible if your GitHub account has access to it. So it meant that collaborators don't have to learn a new workflow. They just create PRs based on the branches like they normally would do in your project. And this was the thing that got me very excited, is so if this affects multiple versions of our software, then we can have people make PRs for each branch, and there's one button to merge all the pull requests to all the separate branches. So we don't then have to merge each of them one by one. We press one button, commits it straight to the branch. Amazing. And this is what it looks like. So these are 5 security issues that we released in 2024. So it's one squashed commit, has all the people who've contributed there, and also that link goes back to the public advisory. So it's like a joined up loop. You can see from the commits exactly what advisory that relates to. And more recently, you can now credit every single person who's been involved in this advisory. So it's not only people who find and report them, you've also got people fixing it, you've got people reviewing the fix, you've got sponsors who've given the people time to review the fix. You might have found it with a tool or used a tool to fix it. So now you can actually make sure that everyone involved in this security issue is being credited on the advisory. And they have to choose to accept that credit. So some people might not want to, but the option is there. And then when you do merge and you do publish your advisory, then the Dependabot alerts go out to everyone who's dependent on that as a dependency of their project. So it could be that this could be a good drop-in for us. At this point, we're thinking, OK, yeah, that does kind of meet most of our needs. There's always a but, isn't there? So, of course, if we want to have all the previous advisories in the system, someone has to add all the previous advisories in the system. So we aimed to launch at the beginning of November so that we were there in time for this deadline. The first task was to find all of these security issues. Now, if you're a new open source project, start doing that now. I had to go through commit messages, release notes, blog posts, CVEs that other organizations had submitted, and Siri's just turned on, go away Siri, because we were not a CNA authority at that point, so anyone could submit a vulnerability and it'd be listed on the CVE, and we didn't know about it. So part of this as well was also we became a CNA, so that anything to do with Mautic that's a vulnerability, we're the people who publish those now. So it was a bit like this, like I was like post-it notes everywhere trying to collate where all of these security advisories were. We now have a slightly different system, so it has definitely improved the workflow for us. It's streamlined the process. It's meant that we can bring people into our security process much better. So instead of someone joining the security team and having access to everything, they now join as a probationer and they can be added to a particular security issue and work on that particular security issue without having access to everything. And it does allow us to sort of give people that time to get familiar with the process before we fully adopt them in the security team. But also, if there's someone in the company who found the issue who also wants to fix it, we can add them to that issue and they can fix it for us. So with the GitHub Security Advisories now, we do have a central location for all things security. Our advisory policy is there. All of our previous ones are there. Our triage and everything is in the same system. This has been a big thing, like I mentioned, inviting people to work on fixes themselves, but also crediting people and crediting organizations who have supported those advisories. The CVE submission information has made my life much easier, because if any of you are CNAs, once you publish the advisory, you then have to push that information up, and the information is already there now, which is a massive improvement. And this one-click merge has been amazing. It really has been amazing. However, there's probably 5% of things that still are not quite there yet with GitHub Advisory, so this is just something to bear in mind if you're thinking, oh, this sounds amazing. It is, but there's still some things to work out. If you rely on GitHub Actions to run automated tests to make sure the code isn't breaking the world, it doesn't run in GitHub Advisories, in the private forks, because otherwise it would show up in your actions log, and that's public. They know it's an issue. They still haven't fixed it or come up with a workaround. So because of that, we still have to maintain a private repository where our core team will take the work that the contributor who's not in the security team has contributed, run the unit tests and everything, make sure that's all OK, and then we give it the thumbs up. So that's a big gotcha to be aware of if that's going to affect you. Merging multiple advisories in one release is still quite time intensive. So multiple versions in one advisory, amazingly simple. But if you've got 5 advisories, like that one that I was showing back there, if you don't merge the first one, pull the code in, run the unit test to make sure it works, then merge the second one, you end up with problems. You can end up with problems. So we did that, and we ended up with having to do a hotfix the next day because we hadn't actually taken back in the new code to every single advisory that we had done. And that gets even more complicated if each of those advisories has 2 or 3 branches that you have to pull the changes into. You can't auto-assign a team access to every advisory. So if all of your security team are also administrators, you haven't got a problem. We don't have our whole security team administrators because administrators gives you the keys to the kingdom. So it means that it's reliant on the admins noticing the triage issues. You still can't push them into a Slack channel or anything yet. There's no way to do that, so you have to just get the email notifications to then go in and add the security team so that they can then all see the advisory. And we've missed a few. We've missed the timelines on a few because of this. If you are a CNA, you do still have to copy and paste the information that is in the GitHub advisory into Vulnergram and submit. It's all done via API. Surely that could be done when you publish an advisory, but not yet. So you do still have a manual step there. And this is kind of an edge case, but we maintain a separate repository, exactly the same code for extended long-term support, but it's a private repo. With this system, you can't actually merge those auto PRs to a separate origin. It's only for the repo that it's related to. So you still have to do some git foo to sort of push changes if you need to support more than one repository. So that's where we are now. Things are a little bit more coherent. Things are a little bit more organized. It's meant that we've had a lot of an improvement in awareness of what the process is. We now do security releases once a quarter on the 2nd month of every quarter. And this system has really helped us with that. It's helped us to have that centralized process. It's helped us a lot in terms of having more people involved in the security team. I feel like based on some of the conversations that we've had in the sessions earlier, it could be that it's a useful way for some open source projects to start thinking about vulnerability reporting and monitoring. And it is a relatively low-touch way of implementing GitHub a security notification process and an advisory process. So that's me. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, first off, Ruth, for your talk. Some questions?
Maybe not a question, but thank you for the talk. That was fantastic. We tried to use private reporting in Apache Software Foundation.
Yeah.
One thing that we cannot use it is the 3rd point on your list is like auto-assigning issues because we have so many projects and only admins of the organization can see the reports.
Yeah.
And I have a rumor saying that this is going to be fixed.
Yeah,
we spoke to the GitHub, developer advocates, and I'm actually going to forward you this presentation because they are working on like prioritizing this issue because for us it's a blocker.
Yeah, I've been speaking to Martin and the rest of the team from GitHub as well, especially about the GitHub Actions, because that's really fundamental for a lot of open source projects. They rely on GitHub Actions, and it's painful. So hopefully when that is resolved, you will have another user.
So this is exactly like it reflects exactly the process we have right now in like custom-made, like copying and pasting email reports to our own issues, and it looks exactly like the private GitHub reporting, but we had to do it ourselves, and that's a pain. We are hoping it's going to be fixed. The last blockers, yes.
On the plus side, I mean, I was able to implement this. Probably it took about 3 weeks to collect all of the security reports from all over the internet, deduplicate them, submit them as security advisories, and then get the system up and running. So you can implement it quite quickly, and it's free. It's free for public repositories. So yeah, it's definitely an option worth considering if you're already in the GitHub ecosystem.
How's the community response to this? Are they enjoying being able to be more part of this process? And can you speak to that a little bit?
I think the community appreciate that it's a much more professional approach to how we were dealing with security issues. I mean, it wasn't that we weren't releasing, it's just it was literally when someone either cared enough or screamed loudly enough. And now it's much easier for us to have a clear backlog and a clear process. Particularly, organizations are more willing to give their staff time to contribute because we can actually add them to the advisory that they've reported. So they'll report that they found something in their research or the use of the software and be willing to actually help fix it, which for us is great because A, they're helping to fix it. It's one less thing for the security team to fix. But also, we're getting to see other developers who could potentially be part of our security team working on issues together collaboratively, whereas we just couldn't do that before. We could ask them to send us code samples, but it's not the same as actually the back and forth and the code review and all of that kind of stuff. So from that perspective, it's like people are quite excited because they have the opportunity. If they find a security fix, they know they have the opportunity to work with our security team, and that's like a prerequisite for becoming a member. So, yeah.
Well, then, thank you so much, Ruth, for your great talk.
Thank you.